The study of early Christianity, especially the theology of the whole movement and of key individuals within it, is conducted by means of the study of the literature of the New Testament. And the New Testament is literature, not simply a pile of propositional nuggets waiting to be ordered into a systematic theology, nor an inchoate sequence of words that activate religious feelings. So what we have to do first is look at what literature does and how it works and how best to treat it. A proper place to start is with the idea of meaning itself. I mean, what do we mean when we say that biblical texts have meaning? What are we looking for? Where do we find meaning? Here we enter into the morass of the debate about whether meaning resides in the echelons of the author, the text, or the reader. So let's look at them individually. Now, meaning was once thought to be the same as identifying authorial intent. When we know what an author meant, when we uncover his or her intentions and the actions that he or she was trying to activate in the original readers, when we know that, that's when we know what a text means, when we capture authorial intent. So the author embeds meaning in a text by encoding it in words and symbols, which is then decoded by the reader. So that's meaning as authorial intent. There are, however, a few problems associated with equating meaning fully or completely with authorial intent. For a start, ancient authors spoke a very different language. They lived in a very different culture, and they understood the universe in a very different way as to what we understand ours. And that's because there's these huge historical and cultural differences between ancient authors and modern readers. We cannot naively assume that a text is an automatic escalator into an author's mind. To complicate it further, text can carry surplus meaning beyond the author's consciousness or intention. And the significance of any writing can be multiplied as it enters new social, political, and religious spaces. I mean, what if authors wrote about things that took on a life of their own long after the authors were gone? What if people attributed meanings to a text that at one level appear to be based on a text, but on another level obviously exceed the author's intention? This, of course, is akin to what is called in patristic exegesis the sensus plenior, the fuller sense of Scripture, by which an inspired text actually says more than the author realized at the time. The recognition of such a sense and the possibilities of allegorical and theological exegesis that it opens up, these have all at various stages of the Church's reading of Scripture been ways of allowing for the experience of Christians to affirm that the biblical text speaks to them in ways that the author may not have imagined. Theologians have been looking for biblical meaning beyond the cusp of an author's mind for centuries. Now, one way to get around this seeming disparity between, say, an Old Testament author's intentions and a later Christian's theological interpretation is to differentiate between what a text meant, that's the empirical and descriptive analysis of the text, and to differentiate that from what it means to someone else, the creative and responsive appropriations of a text in the here and now. That strategy is unobjectionable on one level, since it allows us to hold together what an author said and what readers think. However, there are serious drawbacks to that two-stage way of conceiving of biblical interpretation. First, for a start, the two-stage movement from what a text meant to what it means is something of a modernist construct. There is an underlying assumption that texts are hermeneutically autonomous. If you get the history right, and the theology and the application will just look after themselves. The problem is that this reduces the locus of meaning to a kind of back-then antiquarianism. Second, the meant-meaning distinction assumes that text can be neatly divided into original meaning and later meanings, or it's possible to separate fact from value. Yet there is no escaping value-laden interpretation, even by those who are concerned with the plain, original, and authorial sense of a text. There is no presuppositionless exegesis, whether it's from those with a theological or ideological bent. None of those things a person can claim they are immune from. We're all involved in the text in some way from the very beginning. Third, early Christian readers did not think of themselves as finding one of many possible readings of an Old Testament text beyond what the author originally meant. On the contrary, they insisted that putting Jesus at the front and center was the true and proper way of reading the Old Testament. That is to say, they did not read their Bibles prospectively, moving forward from authorial intent to messianic event. Instead, it appears, as Richard Hayes has proposed, they read retrospectively, moving backwards from messianic event to scriptural text, in which case meaning is, as Hayes says, the product of a catalytic fusion of Israel's scripture and the story of Jesus. And this reading strategy is not a rejection of things like authorial intent, but the discovery of a mode of divine testimony beyond that which has previously been grasped. Taking those conclusions into account, the problem of authorial distance and the failings of the two-stage scheme of meant and means, we must concede that meaning is not restricted to authorial intent, but it's shaped by wider factors like contexts, texts, and communities. So, if meaning is not exclusively a function of authorial intent, then interpreters have been quick to suggest that the stabilizing force for interpretation resides in the literary artifact itself, the text. The concern then is not upon the formation of the text, identifying its authors and the shape of its editing or what the author was thinking about, but simply the contours of the text's final form. Here, the task of interpretation is to adopt reading strategies that demonstrate the storied features and persuasive power of the text by treating the text as a self-enclosed entity. Several strategies have emerged in recent decades, including things like narrative criticism, rhetorical criticism, structural criticism, and variations of them. And they all look at the text and the way it fosters and creates meaning independently of the author and the readers. Let me give one example of that. Give the example of narrative criticism. Narrative criticism pertains to the analysis of features of a text that indicate how the story means. In other words, tracing the perspectives and devices that create meaning for readers. These various perspectives can include that of the implied author or the implied reader, the narrator or the characters. The many devices to be employed include things like plot, point of view, setting, symbolism, irony, tragedy, the repetition of themes, and then there's rhetoric and intertextuality. In a nutshell, a real author writes a text for a real reader, yet within the story there is an implied author, the pitch of the author that emerges from the text, who uses a narrator to speak to the narratee in the text by using these various literary devices, all in order to influence an implied reader. That's the picture of the reader that emerges from the text. The objective of narrative criticism is to discern how the implied reader would respond to the narrative. Now, the advantage of things like narrative criticism is that the New Testament is filled with stories, miniature stories like parables and book-sized stories like the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, and even cosmic stories like, the book of Revelation. Even when we read essentially didactic books like Romans or Hebrews, it becomes very clear that what is going on here is that the Jewish story is being redrawn around Jesus, so that the Jewish conception of monotheism, election, and eschatology, it gains a new coherence and a new center in a new narrative that has been drawn around Jesus. Narrative criticism also means we can wrestle with a biblical book as a unified whole, rather than examine it in piecemeal fashion by engaging in a slavishly atomistic examination of its sources, form, and editing, where we run the risk of seeing the trees but missing the forest. What is more, if preachers are mainly storytellers, then learning how to understand the New Testament books as narrative is a great way to prepare preachers to bring the biblical story to their congregations, who may themselves then strive to live out that story. There are some drawbacks, though. The problem is that narrative critics often claim that one should read a text as story rather than as history. That is, reading the text independently of other writings and without any cultural assumptions or any theologies in mind. The problem is that the New Testament is a historical document composed by authors and designed to affect real readers. The New Testament authors and their readers lived in an extra-textual world. And insofar as it is possible, we must try to enter that world in order to understand the text. So while treating a text as a self-enclosed entity might be appropriate for something like fiction, the novels of Jane Austen, it's inappropriate for the genres of the New Testament, including biography or historiography, the epistles, and apocalypse. Especially when we understand the New Testament is historically situated in a community that believes that God spoke in these texts and God continues to speak through these texts. That is because the text is historically referential. It points to a world behind the text, and it shapes people who try to live out the story, so it points to a world in front of the text. Drawing all these threads together, it would be impossible to insist on an exclusively text-centered mode of biblical interpretation. The attempt to study texts in light of ancient rhetoric or narrative or structures will inevitably require reference to entities and phenomena from outside the text. You're still going to have to do business with the author or the wider historical context or factors that shape readers. So while there are some strengths to a textually based approach, looking at the world inside the text, the narrative or the various devices going on, you can't simply restrict meaning to that. You're going to be forced to look elsewhere. We come now to the role of the reader in interpretation, the range of reader-centered approaches to literature, where the locus of meaning is not in the author, not in the text, but in the activity of the reader and his or her community. Much modern study of literature has simply rejected the idea that we have access to the mind or intention of the author, or we have the text itself and seen as an independent entity. What matters now, it seems, is the interaction between reader and text. Not reader and author via text, just the reader. Reader response criticism refers to a family of interpretive approaches which allege that meaning is created by the activity of reading itself. The logic seems to be that if the author is distant or dead, if texts themselves can elicit a range of possible responses for their readers, then perhaps meaning is not given by an author, not embedded within a text, but maybe meaning is created entirely by the reader. That would entail that meaning is not retrieved from a text, but created by readers using a text. Meaning is not constrained by the author or the text, but by the socialized context of the reader, who is drawn to certain ways of reading and pushed towards particular interpretation. The idea behind reader-centered literary strategies is that the only thing to do with the text is to play with it for oneself. I must see what it does for me, and not ask whether there is another mind out there behind the text. And of course, if that is so, there's not much point discussing the text with someone else. There will be no right or wrong reading, only your reading and my reading. Now, an effective critique can be mustered against reader response criticism, especially the more extreme varieties which decry any appeal to authors and try decentralized texts from interpretation. First, on authorial intention, we should not consider an author to be a deceased or disembodied mind. Yes, texts invoke responses, but those responses are part of the intentionality of the text, which itself is the enacted intentionality of the author. The text orientates the reader towards the author by sharing a common language, similar mental processes, a reciprocal desire to communicate and to understand, a capacity for social interaction, belonging to a similar community. So it is possible to get to the author. Second, on textual indeterminacy, if texts have no meaning, then they are nothing more than a mirror and an echo chamber. And all we see is our own reflection, and all we hear is our own voice. However, it seems intuitive that reading is a transformative experience because there is something other in the text, something other than ourselves, which challenges and changes readers. And while text can be open and carry surplus meaning and elicit a range of responses, text can also be closed and evoke predetermined responses, so that text can place limits on meaning. If that holds true, then meaning is not simply in the mind of the reader. So bringing this all together, whereas some want to find meaning at the horizon of the author, or the text, or the reader, we propose instead that a fully orbed hermeneutical strategy will lead us to affirm that all three components are involved in the communicative process. It appears that authors intend, texts signify, and readers understand, and meaning occurs in the fusion of all three. Ultimately, meaning is the web of cognitive connections we make with the world behind the text, the world in the text, and the world in front of the text. Now, given this admittedly long discussion of the New Testament as literature, the task for faithful readers then is to engage in a sympathetic and inquisitive appropriation of the authors and texts in the New Testament. As a way forward, we suggest a possible hermeneutical model to consummate this fusion of horizons. It's a hermeneutic of love. In love, at least in the idea of agape love as we find in the New Testament, the lover affirms the reality and the otherness of the beloved. The lover does not seek to remake the beloved into something other than who he or she is. At this level, love will mean attention, the readiness to let the other be the other, the willingness to grow and change oneself in relation to the other. When we apply this principle to the three components of the reading process, it will be possible to make a number of simultaneous affirmations and denials. First, we need to do justice to both the fact that texts do not represent the whole of the author's mind, and to the fact that they nevertheless do tell us quite a bit about him or her. Second, we need a theory that will do justice both to the fact that the author intended certain things and that the text may well contain other things, echoes, structures, and the like, that were not present in the author's mind. Third, we need a theory that will do justice to both the fact that the reader is deeply involved in the communicative event and point to the fact that the text is an entity on its own, not a plastic substance to be molded at the reader's whim. If that is the case, then we should acknowledge that the author must be resurrected but not deified. That texts genuinely carry meanings like a hard-working mule, yet a text also inspires meaning like an iconic muse. And while readers have rights, it is not to anarchy. Until we grasp the place of the author, text, and reader in the formation of meaning, most of the present battles about reading the New Testament will be dialogues of the deaf, doomed to failure. In sum, this hermeneutic of love will be both Catholic and Reformed. It will seek to be faithful to what is received while always open to the possibility of challenge and correction.